Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, the intersection between typology and self-growth. And this is my second video where I'm reading through and providing my own summarized regurgitation of Psychological Types by Carl Jung. This book is notorious for being difficult to read. It wasn't exactly aimed for an audience of average people, so I am here spelunking in the depths, and I'm hoping to bring out some insights for you all. I think it's a great book. I think it's an interesting book. And yeah, that's my preamble. The only other thing I'll say really quickly is that it seems like the original video that I did on the introduction was picked up by YouTube's algorithms and got a lot more views than I expected, especially in a short period of time. So if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe because there will be more like this coming soon enough. In any case, let's jump into it. Chapter 1, The Problem of Types and the History of Classical and Medieval Thought. So, psychology in the classical age, the Gnostics, Tertullian, Origen. The introduction was primarily about the distinction between introverted types versus extroverted types. Now I feel like we're going to see that same distinction in various historical contexts. So long as the historical world has existed, there has always been psychology, but an objective psychology is only of recent growth. We could say of the science of former times that in proportion to the lack of objective psychology, there is an increase in the rate of subjectivity. Hence, though the works of the ancients are full of psychology, only little of it can be described as objective psychology. This may be due in no small measure to the peculiar character of human relationships in classical and medieval times. The ancients had, so to speak, an almost entirely biological valuation of their fellow men. This is everywhere apparent in their habits of life and in the legislation of antiquity. The medieval man, insofar as his value judgments found any expression at all, had, on the contrary, a metaphysical valuation of his fellows. And this had its source in the idea of the imperishable value of the human soul. This metaphysical valuation, which may be regarded as compensatory to the standpoint of antiquity, is just as unfavorable as the biological one so far as a personal valuation is concerned, which alone can form the basis of an objective psychology. All right, so what a start. Essentially, we're thinking about the distinction between classical and medieval times, and I guess what Jung is saying here is that the classical standpoint or the ancient standpoint truly just viewed people in this more perhaps extroverted fashion. People are simply biological machines moving through the world without any sort of interiority. And then there is a compensation in the medieval standpoint where people started to be more considerate of the fact that maybe human beings had a soul, some sort of internal, imperceivable thing driving them. So the idea of compensation is very important in Jungian psychology, and you can see it play out at the personal level, but also fractally at various other levels of analysis. And he's saying that both of these viewpoints make it impossible to be objective. Perhaps they're each a little too one-sided. We need more of a personal standpoint, something that recognizes maybe people individually instead of in these broad strokes terms. Although not a few people think that a psychology can be written ex cathedra, nowadays most of us are convinced that an objective psychology must be founded above all on observation and experience. This foundation would be ideal if only it were possible. The ideal and aim of science does not consist in giving the most exact possible description of the facts. Science cannot compete as a recording instrument with the camera and the gramophone, but in establishing certain laws, which are merely abbreviated expressions for many diverse processes that are yet conceived to be somehow correlated. This aim goes beyond the purely empirical by means of the concept, which, though it may have general and proved validity, will always be a product of the subjective psychological constellation of the investigator. In the making of scientific theories and concepts, many personal and accidental factors are involved. There's also a personal equation that is psychological and not merely psychophysical. We see colors but not wavelengths. This well-known fact must nowhere be taken to heart more seriously than in psychology. The effect of the personal equation begins already in the act of observation. One sees what one can best see oneself. Thus, first and foremost, one sees the mote in one's brother's eye. No doubt the mote is there, but the beam sits in one's own eye and may considerably hamper the act of seeing. I mistrust the principle of pure observation in so-called objective psychology, unless one confines oneself to the eyepieces of chronoscopes, and I'm not going to be able to say this, and such like psychological apparatus. With such methods, one also guards against too embarrassing a yield of empirical psychological facts. So, in summary, he is saying that an objective psychology, if it can exist, must be based on observation and experience. But the problem is, what you observe is actually somewhat dependent upon your psychology. The way that you interpret facts, the way that you interpret data, is going to be dependent upon your psychology. I had to distract my cat there for a moment. So, this is reminding me of what I said in the original video, where Jung was actually kind of conceiving of his theory here as a more introverted theory because it focuses on this internal psychological configuration of cognitive functions, and then it moves out into the world. Whereas someone like Freud, a commenter had pointed this out to me, Freud is thinking more in terms of society as an external force shaping the individual. So, cats, you gotta love them. And so that's just a demonstration of this notion of the personal equation, the interpretation of the data, and the compressing of data into concepts is going to be influenced by the person who is doing the interpretation. But the personal equation asserts itself even more in the presentation and communication of one's own observations, to say nothing of the interpretation and abstract exposition of the empirical material. Nowhere is the basic requirement so indispensable as in psychology that the observer should be adequate to his object in the sense of being able to see not only subjectively but also objectively. The demand that he should see only objectively is out of the question, for it is impossible. We must be satisfied if he does not see too subjectively. That the subjective observation and interpretation accord with the objective facts proves the truth of the interpretation only insofar as the latter makes no pretense to be generally valid, but valid only for that area of the object which is being considered. To the extent it is just the beam in one's own eye that enables one to detect the mote in one's brother's eye. The beam in one's own eye, as we have said, does not prove that one's brother has no mote in his, but the impairment of one's own vision might easily give rise to a general theory that all motes are beams. Okay, so that's cool. Another thing that I pointed out in the last video is that when Jung did his early speculation about psychology and typology, he actually thought that thinking was the same thing as introversion, and extroversion and feeling were equated. So that is a demonstration of this idea. Because he is configured in a particular way using those two functions, He thought that there was no other. I don't know. There's just. It's easy to assume then that the world is going to be built in that same way and give rise to that kind of theory. And by acknowledging the subjective factor, you can get a little closer to objectivity than otherwise. The recognition and taking to heart of the subjective determination of knowledge in general and of psychological knowledge in particular are basic conditions for the scientific and impartial evaluation of a psyche different from that of the observing subject. These conditions are fulfilled only when the observer is sufficiently informed about the nature and scope of his own personality. So to really know what you're seeing and to label it appropriately, you have to know what you are bringing to the table. And it would also help to have this meta framework of typology where you know what the other options are, beyond what your default assumptions are. He can, however, be sufficiently informed only when he has in large measure freed himself from the leveling influence of collective opinions and thereby arrived at a clear conception of his own individuality. So you have to see how you differ from everyone else. Does that mean other people of your type, or does that just mean, in a very general sense, understanding where you fall typologically? Like, how deep are we looking here? The further we go back into history, the more we see personality disappearing beneath the wrappings of collectivity. And if we go back to primitive psychology, we find absolutely no trace of the concept of an individual. Instead of individuality, we find only collective relationship, or what Levi-Bruhl calls participation mystique. The collective attitude hinders the recognition and evaluation of a psychology different from the subject's, because the mind that is collectively oriented is quite incapable of thinking and feeling in other way than by projection. What we understand by the concept individual is a relatively recent acquisition in the history of the human mind and human culture. It is no wonder, therefore, that the earlier all-powerful collective attitude prevented almost completely any objective psychological evaluation of individual differences, or any scientific objectification of individual psychological processes. It was owing to this very lack of psychological thinking that knowledge became psychologized, i.e., filled with projected psychology. We find striking examples of this in man's first attempts at a philosophical explanation of the cosmos. The development of individuality with the consequent psychological differentiation of man goes hand in hand with the psychologizing work of objective science. Oof, that is a really dense passage. I feel like I need to wrap my head around that. I think the basic concept here that you should take away from this is that the idea of individuality as we know it today is a more modern phenomenon. So if you're living a relatively simple or comparatively simple life thousands of years ago, in the modern world, we have many different options, many different pathways we can pursue. You can choose to be this type of person. You can follow this kind of career. You can have this kind of relationship. You can have multiple relationships with multiple partners. You can wonder about your friendship. A lot of things that we have choices about were not really choices in ancient society, thousands and thousands of years ago. You were born into a little village or a little wandering band of people, and those were the people that you knew, and there were only a few fixed roles in that particular group. So individuality as we know it couldn't have existed because there wasn't the infrastructure for it there. Maybe the other big takeaway here is that to the extent that people don't have a recognition of these individual differences, then, as he says, psychological thinking, other forms of knowledge become psychologized, meaning these implicit psychological processes that we're not dissecting and pulling apart, therefore influence other approaches to knowledge. A good example, there is a follower of Jung called Erich Neumann, I believe, and he wrote this book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, and it's about this idea. It's about how in the creation myth in Christianity, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, you can actually see that as being symbolic of the psyche's attempt at understanding, the relationship of consciousness, ego, some sort of higher self, like this descent from a state of collectivity into existing in the world and experiencing what Jung would call the problem of opposites. Falling out of the garden means realizing your individuality and realizing that you live in a world of duality. So that's just an example, but yeah, a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. These reflections may explain why objective psychology has such a meager source in the material handed down to us from antiquity. The differentiation of the four temperaments, which we took over from the ancients, hardly rates as a psychological typology, since the temperaments are scarcely more than psychophysical colorings. This lack of information does not mean that we can find no trace in classical literature of the effects of the psychological pairs of opposites we are discussing. So there's not a lot we've been able to learn from antiquity. We do have this notion of the four temperaments, having a sanguine personality. What are the other options? Let's take a look. Sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. I wonder what he means by psychophysical colorings. I guess he means that they don't really go deep enough. They're just a little layer on top that doesn't point to anything deeply internal or soul-oriented, perhaps. Maybe that's what Jung's thinking as an introvert. Okay, so now we're moving to Gnostic philosophy. My basic understanding of Gnosticism is that it was an early competitor with Christianity and had some similar ideas, but was clearly in conflict. And Jung really likes to look to Gnosticism as containing a lot of wisdom that got left out of Christianity as it developed. So, Gnostic philosophy established three types, corresponding perhaps to three of the basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation. The pneumatikoi could be correlated with thinking, the psychikoi with feeling, and the hylikoi with sensation. The inferior rating of the psychikoi was in accord with the spirit of Gnosticism, which, unlike Christianity, insisted on the value of knowledge. The Christian principles of love and faith kept knowledge at a distance. In the Christian sphere, the pneumatikoi would accordingly get the lower rating since they were distinguished merely by the possession of gnosis, i.e. knowledge. So we have an opposition here. Gnosticism versus Christianity. He's saying Gnosticism was perhaps correlated with the thinking function. They cared about knowledge. I feel like that's kind of low resolution in itself, but we'll talk about that more later perhaps. The Christian principles of love and faith would then be associated with the psychikoi. Is that right? I mean, that makes sense, but okay. And Christianity, therefore, lost my train of thought. But basically, he's saying that is going to be rated as a superior value in Christianity, and the knowledge is going to be the lesser value. Interesting to me, though, that this idea of gnosis, of knowledge, to me, I associate that a little more with perhaps intuition, but alas, we carry on. Type differences should also be borne in mind when we consider the long and perilous struggle which the Church from its earliest beginnings waged against Gnosticism. Owing to the predominantly practical trend of early Christianity, the intellectual hardly came into his own, except when he followed his fighting instincts by indulging in polemical apologetics. So the Christian thinker in the early days didn't really have a lot of options for exercising that particular instinct if that's what he felt within him. He could only do it in defending the faith. The rule of faith was too strict and allowed no freedom of movement. Moreover, it was poor in positive intellectual content. It boasted a few ideas, and though these were of immense practical value, they were a definite obstacle to thought. The intellectual was much worse hit by the sacrificium intellectus than the feeling type. It is therefore understandable that the vastly superior intellectual content of gnosis, which in the light of our present mental development has not lost but considerably gained in value, must have made the greatest possible appeal to the intellectual within the church. For him, it held out in very truth all the temptations of this world. Docetism, in particular, caused grave trouble to the church with its contention that Christ possessed only an apparent body and that his whole earthly existence and passion had been merely a semblance. In this contention, the purely intellectual element predominates at the expense of human feeling. Just more on this idea that two separate worldviews are getting developed in Gnosticism versus Christianity, and it looks like perhaps some of the more thinkerly Christians might have found some inspiration in Gnosticism despite the controversy there. And Jung is saying also that we can learn a lot from Gnosticism today. And then we have this idea of doticism at the end. So what it wants to do is say that Jesus was not a feeling embodied human being. That was all just an afterthought, a shadow of his actual more intellectual existence, which, as Jung is saying here, his argument is that the church is not intellectually oriented. Perhaps the struggle with gnosis is most vividly presented to us in two figures who were of utmost significance not only as church fathers but personalities. These are Tertullian and Origen, who lived towards the end of the 2nd century. Schultz says of them, "One organism is able to take in nourishment and assimilate it almost completely into its own nature. Another, with equal persistence, eliminates it with every sign of passionate resistance. Thus, Origen on one side and Tertullian on the other reacted in diametrically opposite ways to gnosis. Their reaction is not only characteristic of the two personalities and their philosophical outlook, it is of fundamental significance with regard to the position of gnosis in the spiritual life and religious currents of that age." So Christianity versus Gnosticism, these two church fathers take different approaches. One of them is trying to assimilate it, and one of them is trying to eliminate it. This is going to be difficult because, personally, I don't like historical breakdowns, but I think it's worthwhile, and the challenge will probably benefit me. Tertullian was born in Carthage somewhere about 160 AD. He was a pagan and abandoned himself to the lascivious life of his city until about his 35th year, when he became a Christian. He was the author of numerous writings wherein his character, which is our especial interest, is unmistakably displayed. Most clearly of all, we see his unparalleled, noble-hearted zeal, his fire, his passionate temperament, and the profundity of his religious understanding. He was a fanatic, brilliantly one-sided in his defense of a recognized truth, possessed of a matchless fighting spirit, a merciless opponent who saw victory only in the total annihilation of his adversary, his language a flashing blade wielded with ferocious mastery. That's quite, I like that a lot. I feel like the language itself that Jung is using is sort of reflecting and mirroring the thinker whom he's describing. All right. He was the creator of the Church Latin that lasted for more than 1,000 years. It was he who coined the terminology of the early church. Once he had seized upon a point of view, he had to follow it through to its ultimate conclusion, as though lashed by the legions of hell. Even when right had long since ceased to be on his side, and all reasonable order lay in shreds before him. His impassioned thinking was so inexorable that again and again he alienated himself from the very thing which he had given his heart's blood. Accordingly, his ethical code was bitterly severe. Martyrdom he commanded to be sought and not shunned. He permitted no second marriage and required the permanent veiling of persons of the female sex. Gnosis, which in reality is a passion for thinking and knowing, he attacked with unrelenting fanaticism, together with philosophy and science, which differed from it so little. To him is ascribed the sublime confession, Credo quia absurdum est, I believe because it is absurd. This does not altogether accord with historical fact, for he merely said, and the Son of God died, which is immediately credible because it is absurd, and buried he rose again, which is certain because it is impossible. That's interesting. Don't know what to make of that. But so far, we're seeing that Tertullian is more of he's resisting the Gnosticism, and it looks like it is a passionate resistance, one that's not necessarily based from an intellectual place. Tertullian the feeler, that's kind of the hypothesis we're running with. Thanks to the acuteness of his mind, he saw through the poverty of philosophical and Gnostic knowledge and contemptuously rejected it. He invoked against it the testimony of his own inner world, his own inner realities, which were one with his faith. So we also have introversion. Is he an introverted feeler? Maybe I'm misunderstanding. In shaping and developing these realities, he became the creator of those abstract conceptions which still underlie the Catholic system of today. The irrational inner reality had for him an essentially dynamic nature. It was his principle, his foundation in face of the world and of all collectively valid and rational science and philosophy. I quote his own words. I summon a new witness, or rather a witness more known than any written monument, more debated than any system of life, more published abroad than any promulgation, greater than the whole of man, yea, that which constitutes the whole of man. Approach then, O my soul, whether you be something divine and eternal, as many philosophers believe, the less then will you lie, or not wholly divine, because mortal, as Epicurus alone contends, the less then ought you to lie. Ooh. Whether you come from heaven or are born of earth, whether compounded of numbers or of atoms, whether you have your beginning with the body or are later joined to it, what matter indeed whence you come and how you make man to be what he is, a reasonable being, capable of perception and knowledge. But I summon you not, O soul, proclaiming wisdom, trained in the schools, conversant with libraries, fed and nourished in the academies and pillared halls of Athens. No, I would speak with you, O soul, as wondrous, simple, and unlearned, awkward and inexperienced, such as you are for those who possess nothing else but you, even as you come from the alleys, from the street corners, and from the workshops. It is just your unknowingness that I need. Goodness. Okay, so what a thing. What an exercise in self-indulgence that paragraph was. Basically, he is just honoring the soul, no matter the nature of the soul, no matter where it comes from, even if it happens to be ignorant or lacking in knowledge, as he says. It is that lacking of knowledge that he needs, and perhaps the faith that accompanies that. The self-mutilation performed by Tertullian in the Sacrificium Intellectus led him to an unqualified recognition of the irrational inner reality, the true rock of his faith. I think that we'll see more about this idea. We'll see more about this idea of the Sacrificium Intellectus. Just the idea that to participate in the church, especially as one of these church fathers, you had to sacrifice something to the greater whole of Christianity. I think he mentioned previously that Origen and Tertullian both approached this sacrifice differently. It meant different things to each one of them. The necessity of the religious process which he sensed in himself, he crystallized in the incomparable formula, the soul is by nature Christian. With the sacrificium, intellectus, philosophy, and science, and hence also gnosis, fell to the ground. So he said goodbye to these things. In the further course of his life, the qualities I've described became exacerbated. When the church was driven to compromise more and more with the masses, he revolted against it and became a follower of the Phrygian prophet Montanus, an ecstatic who stood for the principle of absolute denial of the world and complete spiritualization. In violent pamphlets, he began to assail the policy of Pope Calixtus I, and this, together with his Montanism, put him more or less outside the pale of the church. According to a report of Augustine, he even quarreled with Montanism later and founded a sect of his own. Looks like I was wrong. Tertullian is a classic example of introverted thinking. So I think because he sacrificed his intellect, he had this very powerful feeling reaction. But we'll get more into that later. But basically what you can see here is a person who's definitely more on the introverted side. He is rejecting the masses. He eventually wants to reject the world itself and settle for this complete spiritualization, continuing to found a sect of his own, always the contrarian, you could say. His very considerable and keenly developed intellect was flanked by an unmistakable sensuality. The psychological process of development, which we call specifically Christian, led him to sacrifice the amputation of the most valuable function. The psychological process of development, which we call specifically Christian, led him to the amputation of the most valuable function, a mythical idea that is also found in the great and exemplary symbol of the sacrifice of the Son of God. His most valuable organ was the intellect, and the clarity of knowledge it made possible. Through the sacrificium intellectus, the way of purely intellectual development was closed to him. It forced him to recognize the irrational dynamism of his soul as the foundation of his being. The intellectuality of gnosis, the specifically rational stamp it gave to the dynamic phenomena of the soul, must have been odious to him, for that was just the way he had to forsake in order to acknowledge the principle of feeling. So, one interesting thing to point out about this passage is that he is implying that there is a process of psychological development that we in the Western tradition have inherited, which is the idea of sacrificing that which is most valuable in order to achieve the beauty of the inferior. We have to sacrifice that which is most valuable. So that's interesting. That's something to chew on for sure. In Origen, we may recognize the absolute opposite of Tertullian. He was born in Alexandria about 185 AD. His father was a Christian martyr. He grew up in that quite unique mental atmosphere where the ideas of the East and West mingled. With an intense yearning for knowledge, he eagerly absorbed all that was worth knowing and accepted everything, whether Christian, Jewish, Hellenistic, or Egyptian, that the teeming intellectual world of Alexandria offered him. The pagan philosopher Porphyry, a pupil of Plotinus, said of him, "His outward life was that of a Christian and against the law, but in his opinions about material things and the deity he thought like a Greek and introduced Greek ideas into foreign fables." His self-castration had taken place sometime before 211 AD. Is this a legitimate self-castration, or is this an intellectual self-castration? His inner motives for this may be guessed, but historically they are not known to us. Personally, he was of great influence and had a winning speech. He was constantly surrounded by pupils and a whole host of amanuenses who gathered up the precious words that fell from the revered master's lips. As an author, he was extraordinarily prolific, and he developed into a great teacher. In Antioch, he even delivered lectures on theology to the emperor's mother, Mamaea. In Caesarea, he was head of the school. His teaching activities were frequently interrupted by his extensive journeyings. He possessed an extraordinary erudition and had an astounding capacity for careful investigation. He hunted up old biblical manuscripts and earned special merit for his textual criticism. He was a great scholar, indeed the only true scholar the early church possessed, says Harnack. In complete contrast to Tertullian, Origen did not cut himself off from the influence of Gnosticism. On the contrary, he even channeled it in attenuated form into the bosom of the church, or such at least was his aim. Indeed, judging by his thought and fundamental views, he was himself almost a Christian Gnostic. His position in regard to faith and knowledge is described by Harnack in the following psychologically significant words. The Bible is equally needful to both. The believers receive from it the facts and commandments they need, while the Gnostics decipher thoughts in it and gather from it the powers which guide them to the contemplation and love of God. Whereby all material things through spiritual interpretation, allegorical exegesis, hermeneutics, seem to be melted into a cosmos of ideas until at last everything is surmounted and left behind as a stepping stone, while only this remains, the blessed and abiding relationship of the God-created creaturely soul to God, more et visio. His theology, as distinguished from Tertullian's, was essentially philosophical. It fitted neatly into the framework of Neoplatonic philosophy. In Origen, the two worlds of Greek philosophy and Gnosis on the one hand and Christian ideas on the other interpenetrate in a peaceful and harmonious whole. But this daring, perspicacious tolerance and fair-mindedness led Origen too to the fate of condemnation by the church. Actually, the final condemnation took place only posthumously, after Origen, as an old man, had been tortured in the persecution of Christians under Decius and had subsequently died from the effect of torture. Pope Anastasius I pronounced the condemnation in 399, and in 543 his heretical teachings were anathematized at a synod convoked by Justinian, which judgment was later upheld by later councils. Whoops, I misread that, whatever. Origen is a classic example of the extroverted type. His basic orientation was towards the object. This showed itself in his scrupulous regard for the objective facts and their conditions, as well as in the formulation of that supreme principle, amor et visio Dei. The Christian process of development encountered in Origen a type whose ultimate foundation was the relation to the object, a relation that has always symbolically expressed itself in sexuality and accounts for the fact that there are certain theories today which reduce all essential psychic functions to sexuality as well. Why did I do that? Castration was therefore an adequate expression of the sacrifice of the most valuable function. Okay, so this guy literally castrated himself. Also, he had a reference to Freud in the previous sentence, Freud being Jung's mentor, although there was a break between the two. It is essentially characteristic that Tertullian should perform the sacrificium intellectus, whereas Origen was led to sacrificium phalli, because the Christian process demands a complete absolute abolition to the sensual tie to the object. In other words, it demands the sacrifice of the hitherto most valued function, the dearest possession, the strongest instinct. Considered biologically, the sacrifice serves the interests of domestication. But psychologically, it opens a door for new possibilities of spiritual development through the dissolution of old ties. If you are too one-sided, if you go all in on one function or mode of being, way of perceiving the world, and then you suddenly cut that off, all of this energy that had been accumulating in the unconscious is now made available and can be redirected, and your life can be transformed. Obviously, we don't have to castrate ourselves in this day and age, but maybe it's worth thinking about how or what you could sacrifice and what possibilities that would open up for you. Tertullian sacrificed the intellect because it bound him most strongly to worldliness. He fought against Gnosis because for him it represented a deviation into intellectuality, which at the same time involved sensuality. So Tertullian is fighting the thing that actually is within himself that he is desiring to repress. In keeping with this fact, we find that in reality, Gnosticism was also divided into two schools, one striving after a spirituality that exceeded all bounds, the other losing itself in an ethical anarchism, an absolute libertinism that shrank from, from no lewdness and no depravity, however atrocious and perverse. Spiritual and anarchic. These oppositions recreate themselves continually, no matter what level you think that the energies are resolved, but we can always zoom in and find new oppositions and new areas of tension and release. A definite distinction was made between the Encratites, who practiced continence, and the Antinomians, who were opposed to law and order, and who, in obedience to certain doctrines, sinned on principle and purposely gave themselves up to unbridled debauchery. To the latter school belonged the Nicolaitans, the Archontics, etc., and the aptly named Borborians. So all these people are sinning on principle. How closely these seeming contraries lay side by side is shown by the example of the Archontics, for the same sect was divided into an Encratic and an Antinomian school, both of which pursued their aims logically and consistently. We again have that fractal pattern. If anyone wants to know what are the ethical consequences of intellectualism pulled out to the limit and carried out on a grand scale, let him study the history of the Gnostic morals. He will then fully understand the sacrificium intellectus. These people were also consistent in practice and carried their crazy ideas to absurd lengths in their actual lives. I wish I could study that easily, but I don't think just plugging that into Google will give me what I'm looking for. Origen, by mutilating himself, sacrificed his sensual tie to the world. Not his sensory tie necessarily, but his actual extroverted tie to the world. For him, evidently, the specific danger was not the intellect, but feeling and sensation which bound him to the object. Through castration, he freed himself from the sensuality that was coupled with Gnosticism. He could then surrender without fear to the treasures of Gnostic thought, whereas Tertullian, through his sacrifice of the intellect, turned away from Gnosis, but also reached a depth of religious feeling that we miss in Origen. So we're saying that Origen is a feeling and sensation extroverted type. In one way, he was superior to Origen, says Schultz, because in his deepest soul, he lived every one of his words. It was not reason that carried him away, like the other, but the heart. Yet in another respect, Tertullian stands far behind him, inasmuch as he, the most passionate of all thinkers, was on the verge of rejecting knowledge altogether. For his battle against Gnosis was tantamount to a complete denial of human thought. We see here how, in the Christian process, the original type has actually become reversed. Tertullian, the acute thinker, becomes a man of feeling, while Origen becomes the scholar and loses himself in intellectuality. Logically, of course, it is quite easy to put it the other way around and say Tertullian had always been the man of feeling and Origen the intellectual. Apart from the fact that the difference of type is not thereby done away with, but exists as before, The reversal does not explain how it comes that Tertullian saw his most dangerous enemy in the intellect and Origen in sexuality. One could say they were both deceived, adducing as evidence the fatal outcome of both lives by way of argument. Maybe they saw things poorly because they both ended up being screwed by the church. If that were the case, one would have to assume that they both sacrificed the less important thing and both of them made a crooked bargain with fate. That is certainly a point of view whose validity should be recognized in principle. Are there not just such slyboots among primitives who approach their fetish with a black hen under the arm saying, "See, here is thy sacrifice, a beautiful black pig"? I am, however, of the opinion that the depreciatory method of explanation, notwithstanding the unmistakable relief which the ordinary mortal feels in dragging down something great, is not, under all circumstances, the correct one, even though it may appear to be very biological. From what we can personally know of these two great figures in the realm of the spirit, we must say that their whole nature was so sincere that their conversion to Christianity was neither an underhanded trick nor a fraud, but had both reality and truthfulness. All right, so what a paragraph. We see these people are both sacrificing something of importance to them, but you could question that and say, well, what if they weren't really sacrificing what was important to them? What if they were sacrificing what was least important to them so that they could continue to live out the lives that they wanted to live? This would be like if I, for the sake of my self-development, sacrificed my sensation function. I think that to grow and to become a more whole person and to serve my proper role and the functioning of the universe, I can't keep doing that sensation stuff. I'm doing it all the time. This thing that I'm sacrificing, this black hen of sensation, is actually intuition, trust me. All we can really do is assume, for the sake of argument, that they were sacrificing the thing that they said that they were. Jung seems to think that they were being truthful in their sacrifices and actually putting themselves through the ringer. We shall not be digressing if we take this opportunity to try to grasp the psychological meaning of this rupture of the natural course of instinct. Instinctively, you want to be a particular type. Your energy wants to flow a certain way, which is what the Christian process of sacrifice appears to be. From what has been said, it follows that conversion signifies at the same time a transition to another attitude. This also makes it clear from what source the impelling motive for conversion comes, and how far Tertullian was right in conceiving the soul as naturally Christian. The natural course of instinct, like everything in nature, follows the line of least resistance. One man is rather more gifted here, another there. Again, adaptation to the early environment of childhood may demand relatively more reserve and reflection, or relatively more empathy and participation, according to the nature of the parents and the circumstances. So, chicken and the egg. Do we become who we are because of our early environment? Do we become who we are because of the instinctual basis? Or is the early environment sufficiently rich that it can actually provide a stable narrative foundation for any sort of instinctual basis? I become one way, my brother becomes another way, even though we have the same environment. Now, you can question that. I think that there's a lot to challenge in that idea, but carrying on. In this way, a certain preferential attitude is built up automatically, resulting in different types. Since every man, as a relatively stable being, possesses all the basic psychological functions, it would be a psychological necessity with a view to perfect adaptation that he should also employ them in equal measure. For there must be a reason why there are different modes of psychological adaptation. I love this emphasis on adaptation because it really points to the fact that Jung is trying to be an evolutionarily oriented thinker. He's aware that we are biological beings as much as we are psychological beings. Evidently, one alone is not enough, since the object seems to be only partially comprehended when, for example, it is something that is merely thought or merely felt. A one-sided, typical attitude leaves a deficiency in the adaptive performance which accumulates during the course of life. Maybe your tendency to be a reflective thinker serves you well in the early chapters of your life, but every time you go one-sidedly towards using that function and not its opposite, that opposite function is remaining weak. It's probably even gathering a lot of unconscious energy, and unless you're going to stay in that original situation, which is impossible in the modern world, or is becoming increasingly more impossible in the modern world, not for everyone, obviously, certainly more of a problem for Western civilization, whatever that even means. But regardless, we can see how eventually people become confronted with their weaknesses. Sooner or later, this will produce a disturbance of adaptation that drives the subject towards some kind of compensation. But the compensation can only be obtained by means of an amputation of the heretofore one-sided attitude. This results in a temporary accumulation of energy and an overflow into channels not used consciously before, though lying ready unconsciously. The adaptive deficiency, which is the efficient cause of the process of conversion, is subjectively felt as a vague sense of dissatisfaction. Such an atmosphere prevailed at the turning point of our era. So he's saying there's actually, in this particular era, 100 years ago when he was writing, and are we still in the same era? I don't know what Jung would say. The world has changed a lot, but also hasn't changed that much. The world itself, the general zeitgeist, was full of this dissatisfaction, and that there was a shift brewing. You could say the same about today. A quite astonishing need of redemption came over mankind and brought about the unparalleled efflorescence of every sort of possible and impossible cult in ancient Rome. Nor was there any lack of advocates of living life to the full who operated with arguments based on the science of that day instead of with biological ones. They too could never be done with speculations as to why mankind was in such a bad way. Only the causalism of that epoch, as compared, I think it's epic actually, only the causalism of that epoch as compared with our science was considerably less restricted. They could hark back far beyond childhood to cosmogony, and numerous systems were devised proving that what had happened in the remote abyss of time was the source of insufferable consequences for mankind. So yeah, there are different modes of psychological adaptation. Typically, we prefer one or two, but at some point, provided we are removed enough from our original situation, something shifts, and then we are called upon to use the neglected attitude or function. And this can happen at different levels of society. And yeah, that's all we really need to know. And that this was relevant then in the time of Tertullian and Origen. The sacrifice that Tertullian and Origen carried out was drastic, too drastic for our taste, but it was in keeping with the spirit of the age, which was thoroughly concretistic. So everything had to be made very concrete. It couldn't be symbolic necessarily. maybe the symbolic attitude wasn't sufficiently developed at this particular point in time. So if you wanted to sever your ties to the world and your sensation-related attachment to the world, then you actually had to castrate yourself. Good luck with that. I'm glad that I don't live in that world. Because of this spirit, the Gnostics took their visions as absolutely real, or at least as relating directly to reality. And for Tertullian, the reality of his feeling was objectively valid. The Gnostics projected their subjective inner... It sounds like an Eminem line. The Gnostics projected the subjective inner perception of the change of attitude into a cosmogonic system, believed it. The Gnostics projected their subjective inner perception of the change of attitude into a cosmogonic system and believed in the reality of its psychological figures. In my book, Psychology of the Unconscious, clearly that translation is not exact, I left the whole question open as to the origin of the peculiar course the libido took in the Christian process of development. I spoke of a splitting of libido into two halves, each directed against the other. The explanation of this is to be found in a one-sided psychological attitude so extreme that compensations from the unconscious became an urgent necessity. It is precisely the Gnostic movement in the early Christian centuries of our era that most clearly demonstrates the breakthrough of unconscious contents at the moment of compensation. Christianity itself signified the collapse and sacrifice of the cultural values of antiquity, that is, of the classical attitude. At the present time, it is hardly necessary to remark that it is a matter of indifference whether we speak of today or of that age 2,000 years ago. I got through that a bit quicker than I expected. I'll just try to do a quick summary now. So, in this section, we are looking back on some classical, let's say, historical examples of this problem of types, the problem of people splitting off into oppositely charged factions. We opened by talking about objective psychology. Jung is saying that an objective psychology isn't possible until people come to appreciate the fact of psychological types, the fact that people do have these different orientations and dispositions. He's saying that for classical people who saw each other purely or primarily in biological terms, of biological machines moving through the world, that was a very extroverted attitude. And then in medieval times, which was more soul-oriented, was a little too introverted. These were two polarized ways of seeing the world that didn't really allow for individual differences. And Jung is saying that we have come to a point in history where we can now appreciate more individual-oriented typological differences. So they're still shared and type-related, but we have an appreciation for the individual. We have to be aware of the fact that our own psychological configuration informs the way that we experience the world and that we interpret the world, especially once we get conceptual. There are multiple ways of interpreting the world. Competing interpretations are possible, so people, without knowing it, bring their personal equation to bear on interpreting scientific data. As Jung says, one sees what one can best see oneself. If I'm a thinking type and I encounter other people who are feeling types, I might think, why? I don't understand how you're making that decision. Like, what is your logic? I will automatically assume that they're attempting to be logical, and if I see that they're not doing well at that logical game, I may judge them without realizing that they are trying to use a different set of tools for approaching the world. With science, all we can really do is be satisfied if we don't see too subjectively. We become aware of the lens through which we're viewing the world and what the lens actually does to color the world itself. So know yourself, and that will help you in making sense of other people. Now we jump back a little bit to talk about ancient people and how, because there wasn't that recognition of individuality, psychological knowledge actually was projected into other forms of knowledge. So when people started to form mythology about the origins of humanity, psychological concepts actually made their way into that. As I said before, Eric Neumann talks about how the Garden of Eden myth is really just this story through which consciousness is coming to understand itself. I mean, it might be more than that, but it is also that. We exist in this perfect state of collective union, but then we fall from that state of grace. We realize that we are individual human beings. We are vulnerable through our individuality, and we are tossed into the world of good versus evil, the world of opposites. That is a picture of the psychological development of individual people. So we jump to Gnosticism, which talked about particular types of people, thinking, feeling, and sensation. And Jung is contrasting Gnosticism with Christianity. He thinks that Gnosticism emphasized the intellectual function, the thinking function, while Christianity emphasized the feeling function and being love-driven, faith-driven. So that is an opposition at the cultural level. There were some early church fathers, Tertullian and Origen, who had typological differences, and their differences meant that they related to this problem of Christianity versus Gnosticism differently. Tertullian tried to completely eliminate the influence of Gnosticism, whereas Origen tried to assimilate it. So what we know about Tertullian, I think what's important here is that Jung identifies him as an introverted thinking type, and the Christian process of psychological development requires that you sacrifice what is most valuable to you in the same way that God the Father sacrificed his only begotten Son. That imagery is supposed to be a fractal pattern of humanity, for humanity to aspire to. And so he sacrifices his intellect, which brings forth a lot of irrational, feeling-oriented passion, and he has to reject Gnosticism because Gnosticism and science and philosophy all seem to represent that for him. Then we can talk about Origen, Origen is very enthralled by existing in Alexandria, which seems to be surrounded by all sorts of cultural mixture, and we see him as being, at least the interpretation is that he is more of an extroverted type, and he literally has to castrate himself because it's a very concrete way of approaching the problem, but he has an extroverted sensation, feeling-oriented attachment to the external world, and he must sacrifice that through getting rid of his sexual organ. Yikes. And that makes him all the more, by sacrificing that, he opens himself up to the opposite function, to the thinking function, and therefore he shows a more receptive, welcoming face to the ideas of Gnosticism. We can also see the problem of opposites playing out at just level after level. We have Christianity versus Gnosticism, but then even within Gnosticism, we have a more spiritual school and a more anarchic, libertine school. And then even within that pattern, we see the pattern playing out yet again. So very interesting. And then we just talk about the notion of development. One person naturally leans this way, another person leans that way. Our typological preferences form from constantly reiterating and following the path of least resistance, the course of instinct. Yet, at some point, you may be confronted with the need to use an opposite function. Your mode of being adapted may not be enough, and so that is when things kind of dissolve into chaos and a new dominant emerges, or a new mode of adaptation emerges. So anyway, eventually this process of compensation kicks in, and the compensation can really only fully be obtained if you are sacrificing that thing that you treasure the most, which will then activate all of that unconscious energy associated with the opposite mode of being that's just been waiting and gathering. So again, he's also saying that we can see this happening not just at an individual level, but at the level of cultures. And in ancient Rome, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire, that was a similar turning point. And during that turning point, all of these different ideas and different cults started to manifest. So just something to think about. That was a transition of attitude. That was the death of a particular culture. And yeah, so that about wraps it up. This chapter closes on the question of, where are we today? Are we in a similar position? Are we slowly moving towards a groundbreaking transition? Who's to say? So anyway, yeah, thank you for tuning in. I hope you appreciated this, and we'll do it again soon. Bye-bye.